Can you trust the text in our modern Bibles? Is it the same as the one read by the first Christians? One of the oldest books in the world will give us the answer. And that book was discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery in the middle of the Sinai Desert in Egypt.
It's hardly surprising that there's a monastery here at the foot of Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, there's the other biblical name for it. And this monastery goes back almost to the beginning of Christianity, maybe the 3rd century, and has been continuously used as a monastery, as a place of meditation, as a place of reflection ever since.
The monastery library has one of the best collections of ancient manuscripts. And with my friend Tor from Norway, we have an appointment with Father Justin, the librarian.
Welcome.
Justin. Hello. So nice of you.
Welcome.
To receive us here at the monastery.
It's nice that you came. Let me take you inside.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to St. Catherine's Monastery. This is the library, and I'd be very happy to show you around.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting us, Father Justin. That's it's really a dream come true to be able to come and visit.
The building that we're in is been newly renovated. The building itself dates from 1951, but in 2009 we began the renovation. We stripped the building back to the bare core, and then we rebuilt everything, and we finished it in September 2017. So that's what you see here. We have chairs and tables to make an inviting place for the scholars to study the manuscripts. We have the reference books that scholars would need when they come here, and we've tried to make a pleasant and productive room for the study of the manuscripts. Many scholars want to come here, they don't have time, or they are hesitant to come here, and that's why they depend increasingly on the photography programs that we have. We are photographing manuscripts with high-resolution digital cameras. We will post them online, and that way we can share the heritage that we have. Many spiritual people are hesitant about technology, and people that are very well versed in technology very often are not developed in the spiritual life. And the Archbishop is amazing in combining the both. And he sees the photography of the manuscripts as protecting them, because in the scholar is studying the photographs, not handling the original. But of course the scholar sees it as making the manuscripts more accessible. And the Archbishop has said we have an obligation to share the heritage that is here, that has been preserved in the isolation of the monastery for so many centuries.
It's not the technology in use at the monastery today which is the reason for our visit. Our concern is the ancient Bible manuscript discovered here by Constantine von Tischendorf in 1844.
Codex Sinaiticus. Let me explain something about the name. The first word, codex, means this is a book with pages to turn. Many may think that the first Christian books were scrolls. Rolls contained on 2 sticks, as we find them in Judaism. The scroll was the valued book format in the ancient world. Not only Jews, but the entire ancient world used scrolls for important books, poetry and other important works. If it was going to be high class, they used the scroll. The other format was the codex. It consisted of sheets of papyrus which were folded and placed side by side, or sheets folded together Then several quires were stacked and sewn together in the fold. They added a leather cover, and then you had a book with pages to turn. The Christians began using the Codex about 200 years before the rest of the ancient world. They lifted the status of the Codex from a format for common use to a format for important and significant literature.
Eusebius was one of the first to write a church history, and the whole history is in praise of the Emperor Constantine, who has now put an end to the persecution of the scriptures, and he has established the new capital, Constantinople. And he mentions that the emperor wrote him, and he said, "Send me 50 copies of the scriptures for the churches that I have founded in the city that is called by my name." So when the Roman emperor makes a request like that, you don't say, "I'll get to it when I can." And he mentions, and so we made the 50 copies quickly. We had them magnificently bound, and they were sent to the emperor. And we do not know what form these were in. Were they just copies of the Gospels? Were they lectionaries? Were they New Testaments? Were they the complete Old and New Testament, or a combination of all of these? But we know that the Codex Sinaiticus dates from that time, and it would have been a very costly volume to produce. And so it remains an intriguing thought that it was one of these 50 copies of the scriptures commissioned by the Emperor Constantine himself.
We know that the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, Emperor Constantine, effected a huge change in how Christianity was viewed. His predecessor, Diocletian, persecuted Christians and tried to burn all copies of Christian books. It is almost a miracle that we have any surviving books from the 3rd century at all. Then we get an enormous change by Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Constantine is the first Christian emperor in the Roman Empire. He makes Christianity a legal religion by this edict, from being persecuted to being a legal religion in the Roman Empire. Constantine had 50 large parchment Bibles made for use in the most important churches in the empire. The question is, where are these 50 copies today? Have any of them survived? It is impossible to know if Codex Sinaiticus is one of these 50 copies, but it is certainly possible. Many facts point in that direction. Among other things, the incredibly beautiful craftsmanship of the manuscript. It is truly a magnificent Bible. No Bible of similar quality was produced in the centuries following this Bible. Several centuries passed before we find a Bible of the same quality, just as beautiful, with the same quality in every aspect as the Codex Sinaiticus. The expensive, fine and thin parchment, the beautiful handwriting, which must have taken a long time to produce. Everything testified to an incredibly high quality. Maybe Codex Sinaiticus was produced by imperial command. The emperor certainly had the power and the means to produce such a magnificent volume.
The manuscript is written entirely in capital letters, so is called majuscules, and in beautiful handwriting.
It would have been very painstaking to write in this style, page after page after page. It required a great discipline, a lot of training, but the result is staggeringly beautiful. Your eyes have to adjust a bit to the fact that there's no word separations, and sometimes because they're writing in narrow columns, they break the word or the line in unexpected places. But once you get used to that, it is a very beautiful text to read. In the classical world, texts that were not meant to be kept were written on papyrus. Papyrus is the pith of the papyrus plant, and they would cut this into thin strips, place them at right angles, and then beat them, and the mucilage in the plant would cause them to mesh together. And it is surprisingly strong, very supple. It is an excellent writing material. But because it is vegetable fiber, in a Mediterranean climate, it would last about 100 years and then deteriorate. So a manuscript written on papyrus had to be copied regularly. A more permanent writing material is parchment, but parchment has always been very expensive, and it is a very specialized craft. You can't just find a sheep in the desert and think, I'm going to make a piece of parchment. It's a very specialized craft, and it was done in metropolitan areas where you had a large number of animals being killed for the meat. And the people who made the parchment had to take the animal skin immediately and start processing it. They would put it in lime, they would remove the hair and the fat, they would stretch it on a skin, on a frame, and then they would shave the skin until it becomes thin. What's surprising about the Codex Sinaiticus is that it is so thin and the sheets are so even. With a caliper, they measure between 1/4 and 1/10 of a millimeter.
It was this manuscript Constantine von Tischendorf discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery.
Tischendorf is the first in history to dedicate his life to the active search for ancient manuscripts of the Bible. Supposedly, he wrote a letter to his fiancée where he says, "You have to wait a few years before I can come and marry you, because I have to undertake a long journey in the East in search of ancient manuscripts." And she waited, as far as we know.
Constantine Tischendorf came here 3 different times.
Yes.
1844, 1853, 1859. It was when he came here in 1844 that he took 43 leaves with him that are today at the University of Leipzig. It was when he came here in 1859 under the auspices of the Emperor of Russia that he was shown the rest of the manuscript, and he was beside himself with joy because he realized the New Testament is absolutely intact. And even to this day, it's the world's oldest intact New Testament. So he asked, could the manuscript be sent to Cairo where he could make a transcription, and his transcription would be the basis for the publication of this text. And the monastery felt an obligation for scholarship, for the study of the scriptures, so they agreed. They sent the manuscript to Cairo. It was given to Constantine Tischendorf in sections. He took it to the German embassy and he wrote a transcription. But there are corrections. There are corrections on the corrections. There are places where the text is very faded. And he was hesitant that his transcription was going to be sufficiently reliable for publication. And that is when he asked, could this manuscript be sent to St. Petersburg? He would be there on hand for the publication, and then the manuscript would be returned to the monastery at its first request.
So Tischendorf was in active search for ancient manuscripts, and in 1844 he came to the monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. He was granted access to search in the large library of the monastery, and they searched for really old manuscripts from the time of the Roman Empire. What happened next is hard to tell, because now the story splits into 2 versions. One version follows the diary of Tischendorf, who relates the story in this way. As he exited the library, he noticed a large basket. The basket contained sheets of old manuscripts. He noticed that these were ancient manuscripts of great interest to him. He was horrified to see the basket next to a large kiln in the monastery. He got the impression that the monks had been using old manuscripts from the library to light the fire in cold weather or when they were baking bread. In his diary, Tischendorf portrays himself as the one who saved the manuscript from further destruction and persuaded the monks to stop using ancient manuscripts to light their fires. He returns on 2 occasions. On his 3rd visit in 1859, one of the monks shows him the rest of the manuscript from which the first sheets were taken. That was Codex Sinaiticus. Tischendorf becomes so elated at seeing the codex that he spends the entire night turning the pages and reading the manuscript, which he understands is the oldest manuscript of the New Testament text he has ever seen. The experience is so moving that he later writes, "To sleep would have felt like a crime. It would have been totally wrong to sleep." So he remained awake the entire night to examine the manuscript. So one variant of the story says that Tischendorf is the one who saved the document. The other variant comes from the monks in St. Catherine's Monastery. The monks who live there today want to defend their forefathers. Forefathers is perhaps the wrong word to use when speaking of monks in a monastery, but they speak on behalf of the monks living at the monastery in the 1800s when Tischendorf visited. What the monks say is unequivocal. They felt beguiled by Tischendorf. They even have a handwritten letter supposedly signed by Tischendorf himself. In the letter, he concedes that the monastery is the owner of the manuscript, that he may take it with him on a loan, and where he promises to return the manuscript, which has never happened.
This is where the history gets very complicated. The community drew up an agreement with Konstantin Tischendorf. He was given this manuscript on a loan, and it was to be returned to the manuscripts after the publication of the text. And Konstantin Tischendorf gave a personal letter where he reflected this same language. He was taking this as a loan. He promised to return it to the monastery at the monastery's first request. In 1862, when it was published, it was the oldest Bible known, and so it became sensational. And the Minister of Education in Russia pointed out that they were obligated to return the manuscript. But it was Konstantin Tischendorf and also the Emperor of Russia who said, perhaps other avenues will present themselves. And so they began a negotiation. And the story is that the monastery depended very much on the income that it received from the properties and gifts that had been donated to the monastery in Russia and the Ukraine at that time. And the Russians impounded these income, and they said, we will not restore them until you sign over the codex. So the monastery did sign over the codex, but this agreement was achieved under constraints. That is where the story of the Codex Sinaiticus gets very, very complicated. In 1933, when Stalin was desperate for funds, he sold it to England, and they purchased it for the price of £100,000, a colossal sum of money at that time. So today, if you go to the British Library, you see the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Alexandrinus. They're always displayed next to each other as the great treasures of the scriptures from the early church.
Now, the manuscript was split between 4 different libraries. Many scholars wished for international collaboration to reunite the entire manuscript and make it available in digital form. However, that kind of collaboration would be difficult to accomplish.
The Archbishop was first approached in 2002 would the monastery be willing to collaborate with the British Library, the University of Leipzig, and the State Library of St. Petersburg to conserve all the existing leaves and fragments and to photograph them, and then for the first time there would be a facsimile of all the existing leaves and fragments. And at first the Archbishop was very reticent. He thought, how is that possible? And so he dictated an icy letter of response. Given our differences over this manuscript, any thought of collaboration is out of the question.
With this brusque rejection from the Archbishop of Sinai, the initiative for collaboration would have died completely had it not been for the work of a person who thought it had to be possible to find a different solution.
But then people who knew the Archbishop spoke to him and they said, we'll never resolve our differences about this manuscript, but can't we set them aside to accomplish something so important? And then the same person went to the British Library and said it was a mistake to have a junior member of staff write the Archbishop of Sinai. The letter had to come from the director. And so then received a letter from Lynn Brindley, and she signed herself, I remain your eminence's most obedient servant. And with this preparation on both sides, then the Archbishop was willing to entertain the idea.
Thanks to successful diplomacy, the collaboration project came back on track. Experts began digitizing the entire codex, and in 2009 the result was published on a dedicated website just for this manuscript. There, both scholars and the public may examine every page of the ancient book.
And one of the things that we accomplished through the collaboration was having the entire text online. And many teachers have told me that even a beginning Greek student can find a familiar passage of the Gospels, can go to that text in the Codex Sinaiticus, and then feel that he is reading for himself a 4th century manuscript. The Codex Sinaiticus has been absolutely essential in arriving at the earliest level of the text. And anyone today studying the textual history of the New Testament must become familiar with the readings of the Codex Sinaiticus. Many scholars would want to stop there and say, now we are at the earliest levels of the text. We feel that that's only the beginning point. What is the meaning of the text? What is the significance of it? What is the significance of it to me? And that is the interpretation of the text, the hermeneutics. And that is where the scriptures become living scriptures. The history of the manuscript is so complicated, and some people zero in on that and they lose the significance of the scriptures themselves. And that's what I try to point out.
I have myself encountered fairly wild theories about the New Testament.
The discovery of Codex Sinaiticus has been very important to prove the stability of the New Testament text throughout the centuries. That fact has become even more established in the years since Tischendorf visited the monastery. As many as 67 of the ancient Bible manuscripts we know today date from a time before 300 AD.
It is no longer possible to claim, for example, what is written in the Da Vinci Code, a popular novel. One of the main characters of that book alleges that the 4 Gospels we know today were added to the Bible only after the Church Council of Nicaea in 325. Even after Codex Sinaiticus, the assertion could be made. Because the Sinaiticus showed us a New Testament from the middle of the 4th century. But after the 1800s, we have found 67 manuscripts that are earlier. We may compare these and we see, yes, the same 4 Gospels appear in a New Testament from the 3rd century as in a Testament from the 4th century. Always these 4 Gospels. Never 3, never 5, always these 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the books Christians have read right from the beginning. They are also included in Codex Sinaiticus. What does Codex Sinaiticus show us? First of all, it shows us that certain things happen when a manuscript is copied by hand. There are some variations in spelling of words and expressions, variations between the copies. There is a certain variation at the micro level, but an incredible stability on what we may call the macro level, the large and important issues. It shows that we have exactly the same books included in the New Testament, in Codex Sinaiticus. We find the same books, the same stories, with the same points. We find Jesus walking on water. He is master over wind and waves. We find the same image of Jesus in these stories. The stories appear in the same sequence in each copy. On the macro level, all copies of the New Testament are identical. In the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 6th century, 10th century and at Reformation times, they're all the same, with incredible stability. When you take into consideration that these are handwritten copies, which of course are going to mean some variations in the wording, Codex Sinaiticus shows us that the text of the New Testament has had an incredible stability throughout the centuries. It is not a fraud. No additions have been made. Nothing has been removed. No stories weeded out. No stories have been given different meaning or interpretations because it has been changed in the course of history. No church councils that have edited the content. No Bible translation has altered the message itself. There is a consistency throughout history in these books.
Our visit to St. Catherine's Monastery has showed us that you may indeed trust the text of our modern Bibles. The important question is, what are you going to do with the message of the Bible?
These are not just historical texts. They are the Gospels, and we try to form our lives in accordance with the Gospel, so then they are living texts to us. And that is the significance of them. These are not just historical documents, but they become living scriptures to us.